The chief charges against her were 1, that she was dead and therefore could not hold any property whatsoever; 2, that she was a woman, which amounts to much the same thing; 3, that she was an English duke who had married one Rosina Pepita, a dancer, and had had by her 3 sons, which sons, now declaring that their father was deceased, claimed that all his property descended to them. Thus it was in a highly ambiguous condition, uncertain whether she was alive or dead, man or woman, duke or nonentity, that she posted down to her country seat, where, pending the legal judgment, she had the law's permission to reside in a state of incognito, or incognita, as the case might turn out to be.
Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time we're reading Virginia Woolf's very curious novel, Orlando, a Biography.
Now, we've put this in a cluster of books on history, so one of the things I'm really interested to talk about is biography, novel, which people also talk about this book as, history. What is going on with those terms? What kind of work are they doing?
This is a very strange book. It is a very strange novel, ? Biography, ?
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot going on. It's playing with history in as much as the subject of this biography, Orlando, is born in roughly the 1560s and continues living into the present day for some reason. The present day being the 1920s when this book was first published. So part of the book is exploring what the world, and specifically London or England, is like at various moments across that history and understanding this person's life throughout that history. But yeah, it's a strange, strange book.
Now, you hadn't read it before quite recently, right?
Well, I had read it before a while ago. I first encountered the movie that was based on this from around 1993, I want to say, by Sally Potter, starring Tilda Swinton as Orlando. Really fabulous movie that I just fell in love with when I watched it when it first came out, and watched again and again to the point where it's one of those movies where I could basically, recite every line along to the movie. I love the movie way more than maybe the movie even deserves, but that doesn't matter. So when I finally read the book a few years afterwards, it was like reading a novelization of the movie that had made some really strange choices along the way. The movie is a much more simplified and streamlined version of the book, and we'll talk about that perhaps at some point. It is delightful. It's visually stunning. You, I think, just watched the movie for the first time.
I did, actually, and that was neat, and it'll be great to talk about it. But the book is like a strange experience for me because I read it initially very early in life at a time when I was really interested in Virginia Woolf's writing in general. So I think I first read, and this is like as a teenager, right? I read Room of One's Own, and then I started reading the novels, first Mrs. Dalloway, and then To the Lighthouse and others. And when I read Orlando, I was really disappointed because I expected it to be wonderful. And I bounced off it. And that says maybe things about me or about the time. This was like, late 70s, early 80s. But then I read it again now, getting ready for today. And it was a very different kind of experience. Like, I think I didn't bounce off it as much, but I could see where it fit into the bigger picture of Woolf's writing, and also other kinds of conversations about selfhood, not just in terms of gender and sex, but selfhood in a very broad way. And that was really neat. I enjoyed that a lot.
I also bounced off it the first time I tried to read it. It took me a few attempts to actually make any headway into the book. And although there's quite a lot I like about the book, I definitely can understand why a reader might be put off by it. It's just so hard to pin down, and it's doing so many different things in so many different ways. It's a really weirdly shimmering book.
Yeah, that's a very good word for it. I feel like it's a book where if somebody feels like they want to read it and they bounce off it persistently and they're just not getting somewhere, one approach would be to watch the movie and then go back into the book so you could read sections and freely go in and out, because you're oriented to the bigger parts of the plot, at least.
Exactly. The other thing is that you were very interested in Virginia Woolf when you were a teenager. And so you were reading, as I recall, her essays, but also diaries and like biographical information about her. Yeah,
letters, diaries, all that stuff. I just got really absorbed in. It was the first time I'd gotten absorbed in the corpus of an author, in other words, trying to sort of read kind of synoptically a whole range of different kinds of things. And I couldn't fully understand how Orlando worked. Like, I understood how it worked in the sense that, as we're going to talk about, it's a kind of a love letter also, in addition to all those other genres, to Vita Sackville-West, was a really important person to Virginia Woolf. So I understood that in like biographical terms, but I didn't understand like how ambitious the book was. I guess that's it. Maybe it's a book that sometimes falls short in some ways, but the ambition is really neat and extraordinary.
Yeah, because this book is, as you said, it's a love letter and also kind of a biography of Vita Sackville-West in a very indirect way. Like,
well, but also the pictures in the book are photographs of Vita Sackville-West, right? Like we got photographs of Orlando, right?
Yeah, we get many photographs that are purported to have been, photographed centuries ago, which they obviously weren't. Photography hadn't been invented then. And Virginia Woolf knows that. That's part of the winking of this.
It's so playful.
It's completely playful. But several of these photos, are just of Vita Sackville-West or other members of their families or of paintings of their ancestors or relatives or so forth that are in Vita Sackville-West's childhood estate that are just brought into the narrative in all sorts of strange ways. Some of them purpose taken for the book, some of them just because they were around. It's wild. The photography in this biography, which, it's a biography. You kind of expect there to be photos in a certain sense, but it's also a novel and you don't expect there to be photos in a novel. And it's just, and the photos are so strange. It's one of the many ways this book is just playing with your expectations at every corner.
Yeah. Well, it gives you captions like Orlando about the year 1840. And then, of course, a lovely photo of, Vita Sackville-West, the Russian princess as a child. So it's another important character. And I don't know who the photograph is of. We should figure this out. But I have no doubt that it's a family member or someone who's somehow connected.
Yes, the photo of the Russian princess as a child is a photo that was taken for this book of Angelica Bell, taken by Vanessa Bell.
Yeah, that's Virginia Woolf's sister's daughter.
Yes, exactly. This is who's playing the role of the person that Orlando falls in love with early in his life, and it's very strange. There are two things that we should flag before we get too far into this. One of them is that it's a little tricky because the other big thing about Orlando is that halfway during the course of the novel and of Orlando's life, spoiler for a thing that you probably know if you know anything about this book, is that Orlando changes sex and is at first, raised as a boy and a man and then becomes a woman. So if we're talking about Orlando, the person, the character overall, it's very hard to determine what pronoun to use. Mm-hmm. And none of them are satisfactory, including, nowadays, if we had such a character, we would probably want to use they as a pronoun. But I think in the case of this novel and in the way that Orlando thinks of herself at the end of the book, that seems a bit inappropriate, right? It seems inappropriate to have an answer to that question.
Well, the book is, I think, very purposefully using gender binarism as a kind of a tool to talk about identity. And for that reason, I'm not saying it'd be wrong to use they, but it wouldn't be consistent with the kind of work that's happening in the novel. Though the movie, I think, is a different thing.
Yes, exactly. The other thing is that there is some racist language and imagery over the course of the novel. Some of this is because it is presenting a character in their time, and some of this is because Virginia Woolf was not free from racism.
Yeah, a particular kind of casual racism that comes out in even use of the N-word.
Yes. So be aware of that if you read it, that there is some upsetting language and imagery in it. And we'll probably talk more about that in a bit. But we should talk a little bit more about Virginia Woolf and Vita Sackville-West.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about Virginia Woolf and not a lot of detail because we've offered some of that in our episode on To the Lighthouse. Virginia Woolf's dates are 1882 to 1941, and she comes from an interesting family, the seventh of 8 children, who were very close to one another. And they lived together, the younger 4 of them, even after the death of their parents. Their father died in 1904. And so I mentioned the closeness of that family group because it's an important context for understanding the intimacy of Orlando as a kind of a big, not inside joke, that's the wrong word for it, but a narrative that would be meaningful to a wide audience and also a very special set of meanings for an intimate audience. And I think that intimacy is a big part of it. Woolf suffered from mental illness from her young teenage years onward recurrently. And this is something that emerged at certain points in her novels. You see it in Mrs. Dalloway. You see it also, I feel like, here in Orlando and we might talk about this later, some of the more modern scenes where there's a sense of disorientation. And that might be an interesting thing to talk about. She was part of a very dynamic group of writers and artists, sometimes called the Bloomsbury Group, which included members of her own family as well as a wider network of friends. She also co-founded the Hogarth Press with her husband, Leonard Woolf, in 1917. And I mention that because that again gives you a sense of the kind of community they belong to, fostering not just the writing process, but also getting publications out into the world. So this is their kind of environment. And she had a number of very important relationships in her life, other than her intimate family relationships, particularly with her sister Vanessa Bell, who was an artist, and her spouse, Leonard Woolf, but also a series of personal relationships, some with men like Lytton Strachey, but also with women whom she was extremely close to. Relationships that we might talk about more because they varied, I think. They're passionate, intimate relationships, some of which were physical, some of which may not have been. And so that's going to be an important context for this book. Her relationship with Vita Sackville-West was mostly in the 1920s, and that relationship soured in the early 30s. Woolf died in 1941 at her own hand, occasioned partly by the sort of cyclical struggles with mental health that she experienced in life. And also it was a very dark moment in terms of the political situation in Britain in 1941. And her books, a whole range of them starting in 1915 up through 1941. Some of the most famous are Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse, which I've already mentioned. Orlando comes out in 1928, just after those two really masterful, extraordinary books, and before her late works, which are engaged with thinking about time in very nuanced and complex ways. So Orlando was really a kind of a hinge book, I think, in all kinds of ways. And it's very ambitious, as I said. I don't think always totally successful in its ambition, but it's thinking very interesting thoughts, particularly about time and identity and love, I think. I don't think it's wrong to say that as well. It's very much about what happens to you, like what that is. And that's where that relationship with Vita Sackville-West is so important.
Yeah. So Vita Sackville-West was another writer, a poet and a journalist, and just a very fluent writer. I think Virginia Woolf was a bit jealous of how easy words came out of Vita's pen, so to speak, but also was a bit snobbish about how, her words were better, how Virginia's own words were better. But she wrote several novels, several of which were published by the Hogarth Press to, reasonable amounts of success, certainly. She was of a bit of noble heritage. She had an ancestral aristocratic home called Knoll that had been given to her ancestor by Elizabeth I in the 16th century. And that home was full of paintings, some of which inspired Virginia when she was able to visit to write some of the scenes in Orlando and even to start imagining Vita Sackville-West as having always existed from the 16th century. So that's some of the seeds of where this comes from. Knoll, that ancestral home, was not able to go to Vita Sackville-West. She was the only child of her parents, but she was a woman and therefore not eligible to inherit it. And this became a bit of a big deal, as you might imagine.
A legal case.
It became a legal case. I think it was in the papers, so to speak, and also motivates some of what happens in the novel as well. So yeah, I guess we should actually turn to the novel itself and talk a bit about that.
And it's a very detailed novel, as you could expect, because it's covering about, 350 years of history?
Yes. So this might be a slightly longer summary than some, but I think it'll give you a sense of just the wildness of this book if you haven't read it yet. So we begin in the 1580s. Orlando is a teenage boy of very noble birth, interested in writing poetry and poetic dramas, and Queen Elizabeth visits and takes an interest in young Orlando, specifically in his legs, which we are told time and time again are magnificent. And soon the Queen brings Orlando into the inner circles of her court. Orlando, in the big city, so to speak, has some erotic adventures. But during one particularly cold winter, he falls in love with a visiting Russian princess, Sasha. Their affair is intense, brief, and scandalous to the courts, and it ends with her jilting him. He's devastated. He leaves courtly life and retires to his country estate and falls asleep for 7 straight days. And then when he wakes up, takes up his poetic interests much more intensely. He offers patronage to a poet, Nicholas Green, and continues paying it even after Green writes a poem satirizing Orlando's noble lifestyle and overwrought sentimental poetry. Orlando asks the new king, which now is Charles, so it's significantly later in time, to make him ambassador to Constantinople, and he's very successful in his new post. And he takes an interest in the local cultures, fancying himself to be part Romani, and quietly marries a local woman, Rosina Pepita, and they have children, though all of this happens, so to speak, off-screen. Eventually, emissaries from King Charles visit to offer Orlando a dukedom. But during the ceremony, some violence breaks out against the English. Orlando falls into another deep, days-long sleep and wakes up a woman. She sneaks out of Constantinople with some Romani and tries to integrate herself into their culture, but before long she decides she needs to return to England. It is now the 18th century, and Orlando's title and estate are wrapped up in lawsuits because she's presumed dead and or female and or fathered some claimants to her belongings. So eventually she heads to London, befriends another poet, Alexander Pope. Once again, she's wounded by his poetic sarcasm. She spends some time occasionally dressing up as a man and exploring the seedier side of the city. But then the miserable 19th century arrives. The 19th century. How tedious. She feels an overwhelming need to get married as the Victorian era dictates. And she encounters, unexpectedly, Marmaduke Bonthrop Shelmardine. And they get engaged at first sight. And then, as they get to know each other, they realize that they were both born another gender. They have 10 passionate days together, but Shelmardine is an adventurer and he must head off in his ship. Oh, and now the lawsuits are settled and Orlando is declared noble, though she's now poor, and her estate will go to her son should she have one. Well, anyway, with the marriage and the lawsuit settled, and with Shelmardine gone, she can finally settle down to write, and she finishes up the poem that she's been working on since the 1580s, called The Oak Tree. She heads to London, is startled by how different it is now in the late 1800s. She encounters the poet Nicholas Green again, who's now a professor and a literary critic, and he arranges for her poem to be published. And soon she gives birth to a son. And now it's the 20th century, and modernity overwhelms both the novel and Orlando. She attempts to do some shopping at a department store as visions of the past keep intruding. And in this fractured, multi-temporal fugue state, she finishes her shopping, drives out of London, returns to her childhood estate, visits the oak tree that inspired her several centuries ago, and Shelmardine flies in on his airplane. Time finally has caught up to the present day, midnight, the 11th of October, 1928, the date the book was published, and so the biography must end.
It's a wild ride.
Like, what is that? I left out all sorts of stuff in that, of course.
I know.
But like, what is this?
It's very full, right? There's a lot. It's a wild ride, like I said. Right? And it has a kind of a form, but the form comes much less from the strongly developed structure that we might see in things like, Dante or Homer or whatever, where we talk about books and we talk about like certain kinds of symmetries. Here, there's a kind of a form, but it's the divisions of the book into 6 very long chapters where in between the chapters, what we have happening are sort of important kind of turning points. Like, in other words, the turning points happen not so much within the chapters, but as we move from one chapter into the other. So the first into the second is marked by Orlando's 7-day sleep, the one that you mentioned, where after he's been disappointed by the love of Sasha, being jilted by Sasha, he goes into this long sleep and then emerges to engage in poetic production. Moving from 2 into 3 is the journey to Constantinople, and that's going to be super important because that's where a lot of things are going to change, including Orlando's own sex. Chapter 3 into 4 is the journey back to England, and that involves all different kinds of sort of subjective transitions. 4 to 5 is the move from the 18th to the 19th century, which, as you said, is traumatic in all kinds of ways that those other time shifts aren't. And that's, I think, super interesting. And then 5 into 6, there's marriage, which sounds like a social trivial kind of thing, but it's marking all kinds of shifts in identity in ways that are going to be important, I think, in the novel as a whole. And writing becomes active and real for Orlando in a way that wasn't the case earlier. So it's how can I put it? It's about the building of not just the individual subject, right, over time, over these 6 parts, but also the self as a writer. Is part of what's being told there. So there's a sense in which it's the story of Vita Sackville-West, but there's also, an autobiographical quality to it. Like, in other words, it's not just the sort of autobiography of Orlando. It's a kind of self-narration in a multiple way.
Yeah, although, of course, Vita was also a writer, so...
Yeah, no, but I mean, it seems to be very much about what it is to become a writer from the inside out.
Yes, absolutely. And the other thing that's going on is that each of these chapters, each of these set pieces that are taking place largely in very different times and places, they're all slightly written in a different style. This is especially noticeable in the last two chapters, where the 19th century chapter, where she meets Shelmardine, is just over the top with its romantic prose and its gushiness. And then the 20th century chapter, the last chapter, is very modernist, very chopped up. It almost reads like a parody of some of the sections of Woolf's other books.
Yeah, I found myself thinking a lot about both To the Lighthouse and Mrs. Dalloway here in terms of just the sort of the style. In a number of the passages here in Orlando, you see her kind of echoing, or as you said, kind of parodying, not in a ridiculing way, but just in a like, this is what it looks like to write a novel in the 20s way, right?
Yeah.
Right? So there's a section where she's talking about time, and she says how spring follows winter and autumn, summer, night succeeds day and day night. First there's a storm and then fine weather. Things remain much as they are for 200 or 300 years or so, except for a little dust and a few cobwebs, which one old woman can sweep up in half an hour. A conclusion which might have been reached more quickly by the simple statement that time passed. Here, the exact amount could be indicated in brackets, and nothing would ever happen.
Right.
That's so close to it's a description of a passage in Woolf's own To the Lighthouse, right, where time passes, right, with this second section of the three sections of that novel. And so it's an intimate joke, right? It's a way of writing that would be meaningful to those who are inside, right? As opposed to, which I think is kind of fascinating.
Yeah, it's making fun of her own writing while not saying that writing is invalid or wrong or anything.
That's it.
It's just being playful about it. Like, this is an incredibly playful book.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's exactly it, right? It's also a really, I don't want to say arrogant. It's a factual statement of, my writing sort of sets the tone for modernist writing, of that period, right?
That's true.
Which is true, right? But it's doing it in a playful and self-deprecating. I mean, it's a very witty passage. I guess that's what I'm saying. In ways that you might not pick up unless you knew her other novels.
It is a very witty book. In many places. And it's probably at its best when it's at its most witty. And I think it's led to a lot of people having difficulty knowing what to do with the book, especially, if they're trying to say something scholarly about it, because the book puts forward all sorts of ideas, but it's not sincere about them all the time.
No.
But that also doesn't mean that it's insincere about them. It's really hard to navigate with somebody who's willing to be this chaotically playful.
Well, I think you can get at that in a really neat way by thinking about this idea of wittiness that we're using. Like, now often we say someone is witty, like we mean like, oh, they're clever, they're a good conversationalist or whatever, right? But wit, especially in the context of sort of 17th century metaphysical writing, right? It means like to say something that has multiple meanings, that's often a profound truth you can only express obliquely, right? And the reason I mention that is because there's a number of passages in this book where the figure Thomas Brown is mentioned to us, who wrote the Religio Medici, Garden of Cyrus, Pseudodoxia Epidemica. He's a writer of the period in which this novel begins, who's, and I hope we read one of his works at some point, because he does this incredibly neat thing where he's very encyclopedic. He gets really deep down into the weeds and details of a particular phenomenon, and then kind of turns it upside down. And that's what I mean by that witty move, right? Where all of a sudden you see things from another perspective. And I feel like that is really helpful in understanding the wittiness of Woolf's Orlando. So it'd be neat to come back to that at some point.
Yeah, I've never read anything by him.
Oh my God, it's really cool.
So this book is primarily known because it plays with ideas of gender in really interesting ways. And I think that's what a lot of people turn to this book for now, is to see somebody from, 100 years ago, basically, wrestling with these issues and these ideas. It's probably worth noting that Orlando came out the same year as Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness, which is a sort of landmark early novel about lesbianism that got quite a lot of public attack and censure and
it was a real touchstone in all different ways, for good or bad, right?
It was a real touchstone. It was a real sensation. Exactly. And so there's a sense in which people tend to think that Woolf maybe toned down or figured out ways of bringing her own romantic and sexual interests in women out in different ways that wouldn't necessarily be quite so easy to attack as just explicitly having, two women in the book. And so that's one of the places where this idea of gender comes by, but also, it's a space of play. And I think, Virginia Woolf, when she was dating women, would sometimes dress up as a man, as was the fashion at the time. And this was a real space for how you might conceptualize this in the 20s.
Yeah, I think it's really helpful here to think about the historical context, right? Remember when we were reading Marian Engel's Bear, we were talking a little bit about what feminism looked like in the 70s. And we also talked about Canadian nationalism in the 70s. And, as a way of not excusing things in books, but like understanding what's the frame of reference there. And I feel like for reading this novel, it's incredibly helpful to think about not just the ways in which this novel is talking about women's sexuality and same-sex desire in ways are definitely resonant with Radcliffe Hall's work and work of other early gay writers in that period. But also it's thinking, as you mentioned earlier, right, thinking really critically about gender and how that works and to what extent subjectivity, like self, over time is linked to gender or sex. And I don't want to say that Woolf doesn't have the vocabulary to talk about that. Like you were saying earlier, we might use the pronoun they or other pronouns to talk about identity in a way that's not just binary. But if you talk about gender in binary terms, right, which is the context of the time, right? What's not possible, but what is possible? Like what becomes possible and what becomes impossible. And I found that aspect of the book really interesting this time around.
Yeah, we get this on sort of two sides, right? We get Orlando, who grows up a boy and in the very earliest scenes is very much living the boyish life, if specifically it's sort of the 16th century boyish life, which includes a lot of poetry, but, is definitely like thinking about his relationship to the world and women and like what he is owed from the world and what he needs to do for the world, very much in a gendered way, very much with this very simple idea of what it is to be a boy turning into a man, what his ancestors were like and how he will follow in their footsteps in sort of being a man who goes out into the world and fights and slays foreigners and does all this stuff that earned his family this estate. And then when Orlando turns into a woman, also starts thinking about her new gender in terms of what is socially expected of women. Like when she arrives back in England and has to start living up to the expectations of England's understanding of women in, the 18th century at that point, it's really through a lens of very stereotyped images of womanliness, which is a really interesting passage in a lot of ways. And I want to talk about that some more. But that is also flipped by the fact that so many of the characters, including almost everybody that Orlando has a serious romantic interest in or has an interest in Orlando, is in some way genderqueer or gender, not normative.
Well, yeah. And again, like so interesting to kind of contrast the language we would use to talk about it to the language that gets used in the book. So when you're talking just now about Orlando's return to England and how gender and sex are functioning in a way that is both socially constituted and attached to the body in some way. So the socially constituted parts of it have to do with what you can do and what you can't do. And there's a lovely passage where Orlando is thinking to herself and she says, when I'm back in England, she says, I'll never be able to crack a man over the head or tell him he lies in his teeth or draw my sword and run him through the body or sit among my peers. And it goes on, like all the socially constructed things that are attached to gender. But also there's these descriptions of Orlando's body that are doing such interesting work. Okay, so here's one. Orlando's body has changed. Orlando stood stark naked. No human being since the world began has ever looked more ravishing. His form combined in one the strength of a man and a woman's grace.
Yes.
What is going on there?
Well, yes. So this is another side of it, right? Is that there's a real erotic interest throughout the book of people who don't quite fit into either category.
And it's not just Orlando, the first glimpse of Sasha too, right?
The very first glimpse of Sasha, the Russian princess, goes, he beheld coming from the pavilion of the Muscovite embassy, a figure which, whether boys or women's, for the loose tunic and trousers of the Russian fashion served to disguise the sex, filled him with the highest curiosity. And eventually realizes that, no, this is a woman and therefore an appropriate love object. sort of to his relief, I guess.
But the love comes before that, right?
Oh, yes. Yes.
These details were obscured by the extraordinary seductiveness which issued from the whole person. Images, metaphors of the most extreme and extravagant twined and twisted in his mind. He called her, and now it's her, right? A melon, a pineapple, an olive tree, an emerald, and a fox in the snow. He did not know whether he had heard her, tasted, or seen her, or all three together. I mean, that her there is doing something a lot like the his in the passage I read. So Orlando has this transformation. No human being has ever looked more ravishing. His form combined in one, the strength of a man and a woman's grace. But we're attaching a his to that. And then here, there's this person that he sees and he falls in love with, and all the metaphors happen. And it's a her, but Orlando doesn't know it's a her in that moment. So the pronouns are like straining at the bit here.
Yes.
Don't you? I mean, I find that fascinating,
absolutely.
right? So the binarism is absolutely there, right? The constraints of the binarism are absolutely there, but they're like straining, right? There's so much pressure.
We also later on encounter a character who shows up while he's sort of cloistered away writing poetry before he goes to Constantinople, the Archduchess Harriet of Romania, who takes a real interest to Orlando, who is at that point a man. And when Orlando feels his interest getting a bit too lusty, let's say, that is kind of what provokes him to ask to go to Constantinople. When he returns from Constantinople as a woman, once again, Archduchess Harriet appears, but reveals that this has been a disguise all along, and he's been Archduke Harry the whole time, and has always been interested in Orlando, no matter what the gender, but like needed to put on the women's clothing in order to make this at all possible. And then it becomes Orlando, the woman, being oppressed by Harry's lust and inability to take a hint. And that causes Orlando to sort of flee and head into the city to hang out with other poets. It's, so we also have all these peripheral characters who are willing to deploy gender in unexpected ways.
Yep. I mean, I don't think we get the word performance, but the idea that gender is in part a performance, or at least at times a performance, is something that's happening here. And you see that very much with Harriet.
Yes. And then, of course, her final interest, the man she marries, Shelmadine, who was born a woman and became a man in order to become an adventurer, it seems. There's all sorts of people who in slightly different ways tweak the binary of gender that Orlando is trying to come to terms with over the course of several centuries. And of course, even that understanding of what gender means changes. When we get into the 19th century, there's all sorts of discussion about how the sexes are now drifting apart. And like that sense of what gender is understood to not be stable.
Yeah.
And that empowers Orlando, maybe in some ways. It's hard to say.
It's not linear, like the way gender evolves over time, right, is not linear, right, in terms of how it affects the role you're expected to perform within society, right? It's incredibly variable, right? In other words, it's not like you move toward a period of like some sort of better distribution of gender norms, like, witness the horrible 19th century,
Yes.
And one of the things I find really striking about this book, and I think sets it apart from Radcliffe Hall's Well of Loneliness. I mean, this book is about sexuality and it's about gender, but it's also, or maybe, I don't know if I want to say more fundamentally, but it's also at least deeply interested in this whole question of like self, like what is that? And to what extent is gender and sexuality essential to self? Like, what is self outside of those things, if it can be outside of those things, and or what does sexuality and gender, like, how are they connected to self? Like, how is self expressed through those things? Like, in other words, self is constructed in a whole lot of ways, of which sexuality and gender are two, I think.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating to see the book try to navigate this.
Yeah, this sense of there being many selves in oneself and many potentialities in that self comes out at a bunch of different moments in the novel. But one that really strikes me, I thought was very beautiful, is it's late in the novel and Orlando is calling out her own name, right? She calls out as if the person she wanted might not be there. Orlando. And then Woolf says this, for there are, let's say, 76 different times all ticking in the mind at once. How many different people are there not, all having lodgment at one time or another in the human spirit? It's the most usual thing in the world for a person to call when they're alone Orlando, if that's one's name, meaning by that, come, I'm sick to death of this particular self. I want another. And I thought, I was really moved by that passage. It was a playful passage, but it's also like, you know, we understand ourselves as a self, right? But you can also see, like, if you think back on your life, I mean, maybe this is the product of getting older, right? You can also see yourself as all these different selves who all thought they were one self, you know? I mean, this is a thing, right? And she uses this wonderful metaphor. She says, these selves of which we are built up, one on top of another, as plates are piled on a waiter's hand, have attachments elsewhere, sympathies, little constitutions and rights of their own. Call them what you will. And for many of these things, there is no name. So that one will only come if it's raining, another in a room with green curtains, another when Mrs. Jones is not there, another if you can promise it a glass of wine, and so on. Everybody can multiply from his own experience the different terms which his different selves have made with him. And I just thought, God, that's such an incredibly neat thing to say, right? Because it's giving us these different selves, and yet these selves all have a point of attachment. Like they're like, I don't know, like pearls on a string, right? Or plates in the waiter's hand, right? There's all these selves, and yet they're piled up. I just thought that was awesome. And the attachments, right? When she talks about this playful way, the sympathies, you know, where it's raining, a room with green curtains. I mean, those are also, you know, who Orlando is in Constantinople with the Roma, or who Orlando is, you know, in these different intimate relationships with people, or who Orlando is lying on the grass calling out to nature, right? These are all plates, right?
Yeah, there's a lot in that section that is really fascinating. I mean, part of it is, as you say, sort of reckoning with the various times and the various people within Orlando and saying that in a sense they've always been there. Part of it is this sort of burlesque of that very idea where it's like Woolf throws around, no, okay, they're, you know, 70 something, 60 something, 70 something. At one point it's 2048 or something like that. Like the number of cells within a person is both wild and also intensely specific, as if this were a scientifically understood fact that you have, you know, the average person has 2048 people inside them. Like, so it's very humorous, but also there's a sense in which the book is also trying to show the ways in which this understanding is true.
Yeah, yeah.
And that ties back in an interesting way to some of the language that's used immediately after the transformation, where the idea is that although Orlando's sex has changed, nothing about Orlando, the person, has changed. And yet, at the same time, as soon as Orlando is integrated into society again, into English society again, rather, that, you know, that's sort of not true at all. Like everything about how Orlando has to comport herself in the world changes, and this sort of changes the paths that her mind can go down.
Well, Woolf sort of stops to sort of say, let's make certain statements, right? We may take advantage of this pause in the narrative to make certain statements. Orlando had become a woman. There's no denying it. But in every other respect, Orlando remained precisely as he had been. Right? The change of sex, though it altered their future, did nothing whatever to alter their identity. Their faces remained, as their portraits prove, practically the same. His memory, but in future we must, for convention's sake, say her for his and she for he. Her memory, then, went back through all the events of her past life without encountering any obstacle. Again, whoa, what is going on here, right?
Yep.
Their identity, their future.
But that is specifically there as in both the female and the male, right? It is made explicit that way.
No, exactly. No, I totally agree with you. But like, again, like, it's the moment of change. It's the moment of transition, which something Woolf is hugely interested in. Like, again, think about To the Lighthouse, right? So the binarism is intact, but there is enacting plural identity in a way that we wouldn't use it now to talk about people who use they pronouns.
Yes. And I mean, it's tricky to say because, of course, Orlando's sort of biological life is not quite what anyone has literally experienced. So we don't really know, like, there is no real Orlando. There's no one who sort of woke up with a different gender that all of society agreed upon and you just went with it and then had to deal with what the pronouns are.
Yeah, I guess what I mean is that Woolf is doing something that seems to me deeply contradictory, but in a really fruitful way. Like, you're still trapped inside this gender binarism. That's convention's sake, right? Mm-hmm. But self is not bounded by that.
Right. Yes, exactly.
And there's no language for it.
Yes. And that self both exists outside of the societal pressures of living up to one's gender, but is also, deeply informed by them at the same time. And Orlando, the character, It's unclear whether she ever figures this out by the end of the book. But Virginia Woolf definitely is highlighting this the whole time.
Well, I mean, Orlando says things that, I don't know, are really strange. Like, especially with regard to the passage of time, right? This is sort of late in the novel. And so Orlando is thinking, right? And time has passed over me, she thought, trying to collect herself. This is the oncome of middle age. How strange it is. Nothing is any longer one thing.
Yes.
Right. So this time passing, like, again, this calls back out to both Mrs. Dalloway and to the lighthouse, like, is absolutely part of that conversation. She's trying to collect herself. Now that's an expression, right? That means like to sort of get it together so you can like function, right? But she's also trying to collect, right, herself, right? Like the pieces of herself. Nothing is any longer one thing.
I'm fascinated, perhaps because of how old I am now when I'm reading this, as opposed to how old I was when I first read this, that a lot of this seems to be about becoming middle-aged.
Absolutely. That's what I meant when I said that it's about self in a way that absolutely is really concerned with gender and sexuality. Like, I'm not disputing that, right?
Oh yeah.
But it's really preoccupied with self in all these different vectors.
Yeah. So Virginia Woolf was 46 when this novel was published, and clearly, getting into her 40s must have taken something out of her, because there's a sense in which this sort of middle-agedness is understood in the novel as being this moment when your life, when you're starting to fall out of time.
Well, yeah, and Mrs. Dalloway, which I hope we'll do together someday, is an anatomy of that moment.
Exactly. And so you have the sense of just like, oh, this sense of possibility of being a part of the world falls away by the time Orlando becomes middle-aged. And it seems to be one of the sort of inciting incidents behind writing the novel, is this sense of like, I'm no longer in and of the world. I now exist in my own sphere of memories and cultural associations and so forth. But like, I'm not engaged in the day-to-day exchange of the social parties. And like, this is somebody who doesn't party anymore.
Yeah.
Right?
No, and you see it in the splitting from the house, right? So, it's the book is a biography of Orlando, but it's also a biography of Noel in some ways, right? It's also about the place, right? And
yes.
Orlando's intimate relationship to that place.
Though it's never called Noel in the novel.
No, sorry, that's the name of Vita Sackville-West's house. But anyway,
yeah.
So at the end, again, Orlando is thinking, and the house was no longer hers entirely, she sighed. It belonged to time now, to history, was past the touch and control of the living. And so there, the house isn't private, right? It's the house is in a way the self, right? I mean, it's no longer just yours anymore. It's in the rear view mirror now in some ways, right? It's apart from you, whatever you is, right? And so when the house is being talked about, it's almost another way of talking about the self, I think.
Absolutely. In the section of the book just after Orlando has been spurned by Nicholas Green and so forth, his poetry is not working out very well for him. Before he goes to Constantinople, he spends quite a lot of time on the furnishing of the house and then hosting parties there, parties which he doesn't even particularly attend. But like, this sort of living use of the space becomes an extension of his self as it is understood in the world. And kind of like the house gets to be social where he doesn't want to be social. So there is like an interesting bleed to that. And this idea of the house is this living space of conviviality and sociality. But eventually she spent so much time away from the house and doesn't really have possession of the house anymore. And it's become like on the National Registry or something, you imagine. So like, it's become a historic monument rather than a living house. And it now belongs to time, right? It's now only part of time's story. It's no longer its own living person.
Yeah. And you can see this resonating in all kinds of interesting ways with the way the house gets talked about into the lighthouse, right?
If
you remember that conversation. But here, attached much more closely to this whole question of the place of the self, right? To what, and that's why the house is in some ways highly personal and private and individual. It's about a gift to an individual person and their attachment to that space. But then it becomes diffused, right? It becomes national. It becomes part of time, right? It becomes history. And that comes back to this whole idea of like, what is this book, right? Is it novel? Is it, like, it calls itself a biography, right? And so it's a biography of Orlando in a way, perhaps even also about the house. People call it a novel, sure. But it's also like, it's a way of telling the history of a particular slice of England from the late 16th century to the present, right? And that present part is super important. Like we get the date, right? It's the 11th of October, 1928. And I love the way in the movie they pull it up into the present moment of the movie, which I think is exactly right. Because that's the future and the present is what's being talked about in that novel, not 1928.
Exactly.
Right? I think that's so cool.
Yeah, there is so much interesting engagement with both how we understand history versus what it's like to actually live through different periods, and also sort of how you get lost in them, right? Sort of the way time passes in this book, it becomes more and more ephemeral. Orlando's connection to the time period that he or she is living in becomes more and more abstracted as it goes on. Orlando starts out just living in a moment, which is his own. And then it becomes this sort of like, oh, yes, now it's the 19th century. And, oh, I guess I have to get married because that's what we do now. Or, oh, now it's the 20s and everything is choppy and my head is full of the noise of modernity. And like that becomes the extent of it. So the book asks the question, like, what does it mean to live in something that will be history?
Yeah. What does it mean for your own time to become history? Right. And the novel does that in all kinds of interesting ways. And that's one of the things I really liked about the movie. Right. And people sometimes I think diss that movie a little bit because the costumes are so luxurious and the wigs, like it's very costumey, right? And people, I think, often understand that as just like, oh, it's a way of signaling the different periods that we're in. But it's also a way of showing how much our individual lives are performances or dances almost, right? That have a certain set of rituals and costumes associated with them. And self is somewhere in there, inside there, and also constituted by those performances, right? And I feel like that, I mean, that's a feature of the movie that I'm mentioning, but I feel like that was very faithful to what the book was unfolding in the life of Orlando.
Oh, sure. And the book certainly talks about the clothing that Orlando goes through a lot.
All the time.
Very much a signifier of it. No, I mean, I think the movie makes some really interesting choices along the way and is, in a sense, doing a slightly different thing and has to, for commercial reasons as well, make some choices along the way. But it is also sort of very thoughtful and playful and delightful. They go together well, really nicely.
And I feel it's really appropriate that we're talking about the film, kind of in a combined way, like thinking about adaptation, because that's going to happen again with the next thing we read, Watchmen, right? Because whenever we're talking about history, we're also talking about a highly contested territory. In other words, what does it mean to write history? What does it mean to rewrite it? What does it mean? Like, where does adaptation fit into that idea of history writing? Right? I feel like there's going to be a lot to say about that.
Yeah. When does it become history? Like, not when you're living in it necessarily, but it's when you're recounting it.
And which history? And whose history? And when do you write it? Like, and how does that shape what the history is?
And what happens if you keep writing it like a poem that you've been writing for the last several hundred years?
The oak tree, right? Symbol of permanence, right? Oh,
exactly. Oh, very good. Well, oh boy, Orlando, what a strange and curious book.
Do you like it?
I do like it, but I certainly understand why it may not be everyone's favorite Virginia Woolf novel, why it may not be everyone's favorite novel, why people might get frustrated with it. That last chapter is real hard to get through.
Yeah, it's full of shiny, glittering things, but it's not easy to find a path through it, I think.
Yeah, and in many ways, those shiny moments just many of them shine so much brighter in the movie because they're pulled out and acted in a great, fantastic way. I love the movie. Go watch the movie. But at this point, we like to ask what else we've been reading, or what else are we hoping to read in the near future? What else has been on our mind in the rest of the world so that we can open this up? Doesn't have to be a book that relates to history necessarily, but just, is there anything that you've been reading or in the mood to read?
Well, actually, I was just yesterday in a bookstore that you will remember that you and I both were in the last time you were here with me in the summer, Tim's used bookstore in Provincetown. And I picked up books. And so my bedside table has got books on it. And a couple of them actually are kind of interesting to say something about. I started flipping through them, but I haven't finished them. One of them is a book I read a long, long time ago. It's actually Virginia Woolf's second Common Reader. She published a collection of essays called The Common Reader. And then there was a follow-up, Second Common Reader. And I was reading the last essay in there, which is called How Should One Read a Book? And I found it super interesting just in terms of thinking about, because she's talking about biography, memoir, all different genres of writing. And it gave me a sense of, which was helpful for thinking about Orlando for today, of her as a reader, She's a really interesting reader, like not just a good reader, really interesting. I love her essays, actually. I think maybe that's something we'll talk about at some point in the future, talk about some of her essays. And the other book that's I was sort of flipping through, and again, it's something I'd love to return to at some point, is a book that came out just in 2020 by Mark Doty, the poet, who I love, which is called What is the Grass? Walt Whitman in My Life.
Oh.
And I don't know if you've seen this book, but
No.
And I'm looking forward to reading it. I mean, I'm curious about his reading of Whitman, but the thing that really drew me in, because it's something that puzzles me and fascinates me, and I find it both utterly absorbing to talk about and difficult to talk about, is kind of love of Walt Whitman, like the extent to which the voice kind of calls out to you and you respond. This is something we talked about when we did our Whitman episode, or Leaves of Grass episode. And Doty talks about having this experience where he kind of feels himself outside of himself. And in that moment, I saw the pinkish, wrinkled skin of a robust old man's neck right before me, comforting, and suddenly I could smell his warm skin, dusted with talc from the bath. I don't mean that I saw Walt Whitman's ghost, not exactly, but he says the dead reappear in memory. And he talks about his own memory of people he's known, but also his relationship to Whitman in those terms. And I guess it's just that embodied sense of how we connect to writers that we know very well in some sense, but of course we don't know at all because they're separated from us by history.
Yes.
Anyway, so that I've only just started it, but I feel like that's going to be interesting to think about.
I guess my read is sort of a similar thing. For my other podcast, I recently watched Prick Up Your Ears, the 80s movie about 60s playwright Joe Orton, who had a brief, brilliant, tragic, sexy life. Gay playwright, wrote some really outlandish things, and then died in a really tragic way, quite young. Mm-hmm. It's a terrific movie, and it made me want to pick up some of Orton's writing, which is fairly easy to do because he died fairly young. So you can get a single volume collected plays of his. But the thing that perhaps he's most known for, or most read these days, are his diaries.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yes, which are very... Apparently, I haven't, it's right next to me, but I haven't started reading it yet. But are apparently very sort of explicit and scandalous and full of lurid details about his prodigious sex life. And I'm curious about sort of this like writer diary thing. Diaries it's not a genre that I've particularly engaged with much, but I am very curious to see sort of what the taste of this is like. And I know several people who have read these diaries and really loved them. So.
It'd be really fun to talk about diaries together sometime. I find them really interesting. And I'm sure we could find a diverse range of them.
I mean, Virginia Woolf kept diaries, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm thinking also of things like, Pepys's diaries, Samuel Pepys's diaries, and then, ones that come from other language traditions. I'm sure we could find some interesting things.
Or fictionalized diaries is also a fun way to do it. There's the possibilities as long as like the reading lists are endless.
We could do that with The Long Secret.
Oh, yeah.
Or something like that. Or Harriet the Spy, right?
Absolutely. All right. Well, we have to put Orlando to bed. We will continue our history cluster with another strange book. We picked some real weird books for this cluster.
No, it's good. It's good.
I'm very happy about that. We're going to be looking at Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons's Watchmen, which is, another strange take on history in many ways.
Yeah, but you know what? I feel if we'd chosen history books that have a literary feel, that would be very tedious, right? Because those are not questioning what history is about. And these are really inviting all kinds of questions.
Oh, I mean, some of them might be, but I don't have the time to read War and Peace right now. I do have the time to revisit Watchmen. So that's what we're going to do. I'm looking forward to that, and I'm looking forward to hearing what it's like when you finally read it.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this.
Meanwhile, listeners, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter at The Spouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode will be at megaphonic.fm/spouters/48. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
See you again at the Spouter-Inn.